Marcus Chun had always been good with his hands. Back on Earth, he'd fixed everything from broken toys to complex machinery with the same patient precision that now served him in the most unlikely of circumstances. The irony wasn't lost on him as he carefully adjusted the temperature controls in the nursery of an alien space station, surrounded by creatures that most humans would consider nightmarish. The Vrek's children chittered softly in their crystalline pods, their translucent skin revealing the delicate network of bioluminescent veins beneath. To human eyes, they resembled a cross between spiders and jellyfish, with 8 limbs that would eventually harden into the fearsome claws their species was known for. But Marcus saw something else entirely when he looked at them. He saw vulnerability. He saw need. He saw children who required the same careful attention and protection that any young creature deserved. Human, the sharp voice cut through his concentration like a blade. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know who had entered the nursery. Commander Zhuaixia had a voice like grinding metal, even when she wasn't angry. And, lately, she was always angry. Marcus continued his work, checking each pod's life support systems with methodical care. The youngest hatchling, barely 3 days old, made a soft mewling sound that would have terrified most humans. Marcus reached out and gently stroked the transparent surface of her pod, and the sound became a contented purr. I said human. ZYXHA's tone carried the weight of barely contained violence. The Vrek's commander stood nearly 8 feet tall, her exoskeleton gleaming with the dark purple sheen that marked her as military elite. Her 4 primary arms were folded across her chest, while her secondary arms twitched with barely restrained aggression. I heard you the first time, Marcus replied without looking up. His voice carried the weariness of someone who had fought this battle countless times before. But these little ones need their systems checked, and it can't wait. The blow came faster than human reflexes could have anticipated. ZYXHA's primary right hand struck Marcus across the back with enough force to send him stumbling into the nearest pod. Only his quick thinking prevented him from damaging the delicate structure as he caught himself against the wall. You will acknowledge your superiors when addressed, ZYXHA hissed, her mandibles clicking with irritation. Your species may have proven useful, but you remain nothing more than a tool in service to the Vrek's empire. Marcus straightened slowly, one hand pressed to his ribs where he was certain at least one had cracked. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he'd learned to work through worse. Much worse. He turned to face the commander, his brown eyes meeting her compound gaze without flinching. Is there something specific you need, Commander? Or are you just here for your daily reminder of who's in charge? Another blow, this one to his face. Marcus's head snapped back, blood flowing from his split lip. Around them, several of the Vrek's children began making distress sounds, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with agitation. The smallest one, the one Marcus had been comforting, pressed herself against the side of her pod closest to him. Silence your insolence, ZYXHA commanded. The Queen has summoned you. Marcus felt his blood run cold. In the 6 months he'd been aboard the station, he'd never been called before the Queen. Few non-Vreks ever were, and fewer still returned from such meetings unchanged. He wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand and nodded. Give me 5 minutes to finish the cycle checks. You will come now. The children need. The third blow sent Marcus to his knees. This time, ZYXHA had used her secondary arms as well, striking him in the stomach with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. As he gasped for breath, he heard the distressed cries of the young Vreks growing louder. Please, he wheezed, struggling to his feet. They're frightened. Let me just calm them down first. ZYXHA's expression, insofar as Marcus could read Vrek's emotions, seemed to shift from anger to something approaching confusion. She looked at the agitated children, then back at the bleeding human who was more concerned about their welfare than his own pain. You would delay an audience with the Queen for these larvae? Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the control panel and began entering a sequence that would release mild sedatives into each pod. Not enough to harm the children, but sufficient to help them sleep through his absence. As each pod's indicators shifted to rest mode, the distressed sounds gradually faded. They don't understand why the violence, he said quietly. All they know is that something bad happened near them, and now they're afraid. It's not their fault they were born into a warrior species. ZYXHA stared at him for a long moment. In her culture, The young were the responsibility of the collective, tended by drones whose only purpose was their care. The concept of an individual, especially a member of an entirely different species, showing such personal concern for Vrek's offspring, was unprecedented. You speak of them as if they were your own spawn. All children deserve protection, Marcus replied, checking the monitors one final time. Doesn't matter what species they are. The journey through the station's corridors was a study in controlled intimidation. HFY led the way, her heavy footsteps echoing off the bioorganic walls that pulsed with their own inner light. Marcus followed, trying to ignore the curious and hostile stares of the various Vreks they passed. Some were workers, their smaller frames and duller coloring marking them as the labor caste. Others were warriors like HFY, their scarred exoskeletons telling stories of battles fought across the galaxy. And then there are the others, the ones whose functions Marcus could only guess at, whose modifications range from the subtle to the grotesque. The Vreks were a species that embraced biological adaptation as readily as humans embrace technology. If a job required different capabilities, they simply grew them. The Queen's chamber was unlike anything Marcus had ever seen. The walls curved impossibly high overhead, disappearing into darkness that seemed to pulse with its own life. Bioluminescent patterns played across every surface, creating an ever-shifting display of light and shadow. And at the center of it all, surrounded by a pool of what looked like liquid starlight, was the Queen herself. Marcus had seen images, of course. Every human in the galaxy knew what a Vrek's Queen looked like. But seeing Her Majesty New York laugh in person was an entirely different experience. She was massive, easily twice the size of even the largest warrior, her body a perfect fusion of arachnid and cephalopod features. Her skin was translucent like her children's, but instead of simple bioluminescent veins, entire galaxies seemed to swirl beneath the surface. 8 primary arms supported her upper body, while dozens of smaller appendages moved with constant, hypnotic motion. But it was her eyes that caught Marcus's attention. Unlike the compound eyes of her subjects, the Queen possessed what appeared to be traditional mammalian eyes, large, dark, and undeniably intelligent. They fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his soul. So her voice resonated not through the air, but directly into Marcus's mind, a sensation that was both intimate and terrifying. You are the human who tend my children. Marcus bowed as deeply as his injured ribs would allow. Your Majesty, I am honored by your attention. Are you? The mental voice carried undertones of amusement. Most beings find my attention rather overwhelming. Yet you show no fear. Respect and fear aren't the same thing, Your Majesty. A ripple passed through the liquid around the Queen's base, and her smaller appendages moved in what Marcus suspected was the Vrek's equivalent of laughter. Interesting. Do you know why I summoned you, human? I assume it has to do with my care of the children. Indeed, there have been reports. It seems you have been observed behaving in ways that my commanders find unusual. Marcus glanced sideways at HFY, who stood at rigid attention beside him. The commander's expression was unreadable, but her posture suggested she was as uncomfortable with this conversation as he was. I care for the children as I would any young creatures under my protection, Your Majesty. Yes, that is precisely what puzzles my warriors. Commander HFY reports that you willingly endure punishment rather than neglect their needs, that you comfort them when they're distressed, that you have even been observed singing to them. The last observation was delivered with such disbelief that Marcus almost smiled despite the gravity of his situation. It was true. Sometimes, when the children were particularly restless, he would hum old earth lullabies. The vibrations seemed to soothe them, though he'd never been able to explain exactly why. Music has a calming effect on most young creatures, Your Majesty. I didn't think it would cause harm. Harm? The Queen's mental voice rose in pitch. You misunderstand, human. I'm not concerned about harm. I am curious about motivation. In all the centuries of Vrek's history, no non-Vreks has ever shown such dedication to our offspring. What do you hope to gain? It was the question Marcus had been dreading. How could he explain to an alien queen that he didn't hope to gain anything? That the simple act of caring for children, regardless of their species, was reward enough? That seeing them healthy and content gave him a sense of purpose he'd never found anywhere else. Nothing, Your Majesty. I hope to gain nothing. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the constant pulse of the bioluminescent walls seemed to pause. When the queen finally spoke again, her mental voice was barely a whisper. Nothing. The children deserve care and protection. I'm capable of providing both. That's enough for me. Another long pause. Then, suddenly, Marcus felt a presence in his mind. Not the queen's voice, but something far more invasive. It was as if someone was rifling through his memories, examining his thoughts and motivations with the clinical detachment of a scientist studying a specimen. Images flashed through his consciousness. His childhood on Earth, growing up in the overcrowded slums of New Angeles. His parents working multiple jobs just to keep food on the table. The day he'd found an injured kitten in an alley and spent his lunch money on medicine for it. His enlistment in the Terran Defense Force, not for glory or adventure, but because it was the only way to afford the education he needed to become a veterinarian. The war with the Vrex Empire, the devastating defeat of the human fleet, his capture along with thousands of other survivors. The months of harsh treatment as the Vrex try to break their spirits and turn them into compliant workers. And then the assignment to the nursery. A punishment, he'd been told. The worst possible duty for a human, tending to the spawn of their enemies. But from a moment he'd seen those fragile young creatures struggling to survive in their artificial wombs, all thoughts of revenge or escape had faded. They were just children, and children needed someone to care for them. The presence withdrew from his mind as suddenly as it had entered, leaving Marcus gasping and disoriented. He found himself on his knees, blood trickling from his nose where the mental intrusion had been particularly intense. Remarkable, the queen said, and for the first time, her voice carried something that might have been wonder. In all my years, I have never encountered a mind so pure in its intentions. You truly seek nothing for yourself. Marcus wiped the blood from his nose and struggled to his feet. I told you, Your Majesty. The children are enough. Yes, they are, aren't they? The queen's massive form shifted, and Marcus caught a glimpse of something he hadn't noticed before. Beneath the main bulk of her body, partially hidden by the swirling liquid, were dozens of egg sacs. The queen wasn't just the ruler of her species, she was literally their mother. Tell me, human, what do you know of Vrex reproductive cycles? The sudden change of topic caught Marcus off guard. I know the basics, Your Majesty. Queens lay eggs in specialized chambers, and the young develop over a period of roughly 8 standard months before hatching. Correct, but incomplete. What you do not know is that each queen can only produce a limited number of offspring in her lifetime. Every egg is precious beyond measure. Every hatchling an irreplaceable gift to the species. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure where this was leading. I've been queen for over 3 centuries, she continued. In that time, I have laid exactly 1,437 eggs. Of those, only 893 have successfully hatched. Of the survivors, barely half have lived to reach maturity. The numbers hit Marcus like a physical blow. He'd known that Vrex children were fragile. Their early development required precise environmental controls and constant monitoring. But he'd never realized just how precarious their survival actually was. The ones in my care, he said quietly. How many are expected to survive? Before your arrival? Perhaps half. The previous caretaker was adequate, but no more than that. And since I took over, every single hatchling under your care has not only survived but thrived. Their development rates have exceeded all previous records. Their health indicators are consistently in the optimal range. And, perhaps most remarkably, they display none of the psychological trauma that typically affects orphan larvae. Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with his injuries. They're good kids. They just needed someone who cared about them. Yes, the queen said, and her mental voice was soft with an emotion Marcus couldn't identify. They are good children, and they have found someone who cares for them as if they were his own. She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Commander ZYXA. Yes, Your Majesty. ZYXA snapped to attention, her exoskeleton clicking with nervous energy. You will no longer strike this human. You will no longer punish him for prioritizing the children's welfare. You will, in fact, ensure that he has everything he needs to continue his work. But, Your Majesty, he is just a human slave. He is the most effective caretaker my offspring have ever known. The Queen's voice carried a dangerous edge. Would you prefer to return to the previous mortality rates? No, Your Majesty. Of course not. Then, you will treat him with the respect due to one who protects the future of our species. Marcus stared at the exchange in disbelief. In the space of a single conversation, his status had somehow shifted from prisoner to what? Protector? He wasn't sure, but he knew his life had just changed dramatically. Human, the Queen's attention returned to him. You will continue your work in the nursery. But I have additional duties for you. Whatever you need, Your Majesty. I am currently carrying my final clutch. 23 eggs, each one representing the last hope for certain genetic lines within our species. They will hatch within the next standard month, and their survival is crucial not just for my legacy, but for the future of the Vrex Empire itself. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical presence. Understand, do you? These children will be different from the others. Stronger, yes, but also more fragile during their early development. They will require constant attention, specialized care, and above all, the kind of dedication you have shown their siblings. They'll have it, Marcus said without hesitation. The Queen studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes seeming to peer into his very soul. I believe they will, she said finally. And perhaps, when they are old enough, you will tell them stories of the human who chose to love them rather than hate them, despite everything my people have done to yours. As Marcus was led from the Queen's chamber, his mind reeled with the implications of what had just occurred. He'd come here expecting punishment, possibly death. Instead, he'd somehow become one of the most protected individuals on the station. But more than that, he'd been entrusted with the care of what might be the most important children in Vrex history. The irony wasn't lost on him. A human, member of a species at war with the Vrex Empire, had become the guardian of their future. And as he returned to the nursery to check on his charges, Marcus found himself looking forward to meeting the 23 new additions to his strange, wonderful, terrifying family. The youngest hatchling was awake when he arrived, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with what he'd learned to recognize as contentment. Marcus placed his hand against her pod, and she immediately pressed herself against the transparent wall, seeking contact with the alien creature who had somehow become her protector. Don't worry, little one, he whispered. You're safe here, and you're going to have some new brothers and sisters soon. Outside the nursery, Commander HFY stood in the corridor, still processing what had occurred in the Queen's chamber. For the first time in her military career, she found herself questioning not just orders, but fundamental assumptions about strength, weakness, and what it truly meant to serve the Empire. And in the depths of the station, 23 eggs pulsed with new life, unaware that their future depended on the continued health and dedication of a human who had chosen love over hate, hope over despair, and compassion over revenge. The first part of Marcus Chen's impossible journey was complete, but the challenges ahead would test not just his resolve, but the very foundations of what both species believed about themselves and each other. The changes came gradually at first. Marcus noticed them in small ways. The way workers no longer shouldered past him in the corridors, the slightly better quality of food in his daily rations, the absence of casual violence that had been a constant companion since his arrival on the station. But the most significant change was in Commander HFY herself. Where once she had been quick with her claws and sharp with her words, now she watched him with something approaching curiosity. She still accompanied him on his rounds through the nursery, but her presence felt less like surveillance and more like protection. It was a strange sensation for Marcus, being protected by someone who had spent months making his life miserable. The temperature in Pod 7 is fluctuating, Marcus reported, checking his readings for the third time that morning. It's still within acceptable parameters, but the variance is larger than usual. HFY moved to examine the readouts herself, her secondary arms working the controls with surprising delicacy. The bioregulator may need recalibration. I will have a technician examine it. Thank you. The words still felt strange in Marcus's mouth when directed at the commander. 6 weeks had passed since his audience with the queen, and he was still adjusting to his new circumstances. The hatchling in Pod 7, ZYXHA continued, not looking at him. She has been under your care. For how long? For months. She was one of the first group I was assigned. Marcus glanced at the pod in question, where a young Vrex about the size of a house cat was practicing her first attempts at web spinning. She was smaller than the others when she hatched, but she's caught up nicely. You named her. It wasn't a question. Marcus had been wondering when someone would notice that he'd started using names for the children instead of the numerical designations preferred by Vrex protocol. I call her Silk. Her web patterns are more intricate than usual for her age. Silk. ZYXHA pronounced the human word carefully, her mandibles clicking with the unfamiliar sounds. And the others? Marcus gestured around the nursery. Shimmer, for the one whose bioluminescence is particularly bright. Thread, who's always tangling himself up. Echo, who mimics sounds better than any of her clutchmates. They're individuals, Commander. They deserve individual recognition. ZYXHA was quiet for a long moment, studying the children as they went about their daily activities. To Vrex's eyes, they were simply larvae, temporarily important, but ultimately expendable until they prove their worth through survival and growth. But Marcus spoke of them as if each one possessed inherent value, regardless of their eventual contributions to the Empire. In Vrex society, she said slowly, young are given names only after they complete their first molt and demonstrate their caste affinity. Before that, there's simply potential. Every living thing has value from the moment it draws breath, Marcus replied, adjusting the nutrient flow to one of the pods. They don't have to earn the right to be treated as individuals, even if they grow up to be your enemies. The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus paused in his work, considering his response carefully. It was a fair question. These children would indeed grow up to serve an empire that was actively at war with humanity. Some of them might even participate in raids against human colonies or command ships that hunted human vessels through the void. I can't control what they'll choose to do when they're adults, he said finally. All I can do is give them the best possible start in life. Maybe if they grow up knowing that at least one human showed them kindness, they'll remember that when they make their own choices about how to treat others. You think you can change the nature of our species through kindness to children? I think kindness is never wasted, no matter where it's directed. Marcus finished his adjustments and moved to the next pod. And I think children remember more than adults give them credit for. As if responding to his words, several of the young Vrex began making their particular chirping sounds. A noise Marcus had learned indicated contentment and security. They recognized his voice, his scent, his presence as something positive in their limited world. They do seem different when you are here, ZYXHA admitted reluctantly. More calm, more responsive to stimuli. They trust me. Trust is important for proper development in any species. Trust. ZYXHA repeated the word as if tasting something foreign. Vrex children learn to trust the collective, the empire, the strength of their caste. They do not typically form attachments to individuals. Maybe they should. Marcus looked up from his work, meeting the commander's compound gaze directly. Individual bonds create emotional resilience. These children are developing psychological profiles unlike any in your historical records because they feel secure and valued as individuals. And you believe this is beneficial? I know it is. Happy children become more adaptable adults, more creative problem solvers, more capable of forming beneficial relationships with others. Marcus paused, then added quietly, more capable of mercy. The last word hit ZYXHA like a physical blow. Mercy was not a concept that featured prominently in Vrex military doctrine. Enemies were to be defeated, conquered, absorbed into the empire, or eliminated entirely. The idea that mercy might be valuable, might even represent a form of strength, was alien to everything she'd been taught. But watching Marcus work with the children, seeing their obvious affection for him and his patient, gentle responses to their needs, she found herself questioning assumptions she'd never before examined. The Queen's final clutch, she said, changing the subject to safer ground. When do you expect them to hatch? Soon. Very soon. Marcus moved to a separate section of the nursery where 23 larger pods dominated the space. The eggs within were visibly different from standard Vrex offspring. Larger, more complex, pulsing with patterns of bioluminescence that seemed almost hypnotically beautiful. "These will be the most important children I've ever cared for," he continued, checking the readings on each pod with meticulous attention to detail. The queen made it clear that their survival isn't just important. It's crucial to the future of your entire species. And you feel no resentment at being asked to ensure the survival of those who will one day rule over your people. Marcus considered the question seriously. These eggs contain children, not rulers, not conquerors, not symbols of oppression, just children who will need care and protection while they grow. That's all I see when I look at them. All you see, or all you choose to see. Maybe both. Marcus smiled slightly. But I found that what you choose to see often becomes what's actually there. Before ZYXA could respond to this cryptic statement, alarms began sounding throughout the nursery. Both Marcus and the commander immediately turned their attention to the pods containing the queen's final clutch. But the alerts weren't coming from there. Instead, emergency indicators were flashing on 3 of the pods containing older hatchlings. Environmental controls failing in pods 12, 15, and 18, Marcus called out, his hands already flying over the control interfaces. Temperature dropping rapidly in all 3 units. ZYXA was beside him instantly, her own manipulator arms working to manually override the failing systems. Backup power? Not responding. Something's wrong with the primary bioregulators. Marcus's voice remained calm despite the gravity of the situation. Inside the failing pods, 3 young Vrex were beginning to show signs of distress, their bioluminescent patterns flickering erratically as their life support systems struggled to maintain stable conditions. "I'm calling for emergency technicians," ZYXA announced, activating her communication systems. "There's no time." Marcus was already moving toward a maintenance panel on the far wall. "At the rate those systems are failing, the children will be in critical condition before help arrives." "What are you doing?" "Manual bypass. I can reroute power from non-essential systems, but I'll have to do it from inside the maintenance core." Marcus began removing panels with practiced efficiency. "Keep monitoring their vital signs. If their temperature drops below the amber line, increase the metabolic stimulants. You cannot enter the maintenance core. It requires bio-coded authorization that only Vrex personnel possess." "I know." Marcus had already removed enough panels to reveal the pulsing, organic interior of the station's biomechanical systems. But sometimes you have to break rules to save lives. Without waiting for permission, he squeezed into the narrow space between writhing bioconduits and pulsing nerve clusters. The sensation was deeply unpleasant, like crawling through the interior of a living creature. But Marcus forced himself to focus on the task at hand. The failing regulators were easy to identify. Their bioluminescence had dimmed to a sickly yellow-green, and they felt hot to the touch. Marcus located the bypass conduits and began the delicate work of rerouting power around the damaged components. "Vitals are stabilizing in Pod 12, ZYXA called out. "Whatever you are doing, continue. Working on it," Marcus replied through gritted teeth. The bioconduits were not designed for human contact, and every touch sent unpleasant shocks through his nervous system. But gradually, one by one, the failing systems came back online. By the time Marcus extracted himself from the maintenance core, emergency technicians had arrived and were working to replace the damaged bioregulators. The children in all 3 pods were stable, their vital signs returning to normal ranges. That was, ZYXA paused, seeming to search for the right words, impressive, and completely unauthorized. "The biocore systems are restricted to certified technicians only." "I know, but the children couldn't wait for proper authorization. You could have been seriously injured. The bioconduits carry enough electrical charge to kill a human." Marcus shrugged, wincing slightly as the motion reminded him of his various aches and pains. "Could have. Wasn't. That's what matters." ZYXA stared at him for a long moment. In Vrex culture, such blatant disregard for protocol would normally result in severe punishment. But how do you punish someone for saving lives? How do you criticize actions that prevented the loss of irreplaceable genetic material? "Your medical status," she said finally. "Are you injured?" "Nothing serious. Some electrical burns, but they'll heal." Marcus was already returning his attention to the children, checking each one individually to ensure they had suffered no lasting effect from their ordeal. You will report to medical for evaluation. After I finish my rounds, you will report to medical immediately. Commander, with respect, these children just experienced a traumatic event. They need reassurance and stability right now more than I need medical attention. Another moment of silence. Then, to Marcus's surprise, ZYXA activated her communication system again. Medical team to Nursery 7. Emergency consultation required. Thank you, Marcus said quietly. Do not thank me yet. I am also required to report your unauthorized access to the biocore systems. I understand. Do you? This will likely result in another audience with the Queen. Such actions cannot be overlooked, regardless of their outcome. Marcus nodded, continuing his careful examination of each rescued child. I know, but I make the same choice again. The medical team arrived within minutes, led by a senior physician whose modified anatomy included specialized optical organs that allowed her to see in spectrums invisible to most species. She examined Marcus with the clinical detachment typical of her profession, paying particular attention to the electrical burns on his hands and arms. Damage is superficial, but extensive, she announced. Bioelectrical disruption to nervous system functions. You will require treatment. Can it wait until my shift is complete? Absolutely not. The longer these injuries remain untreated, the higher the risk of permanent nerve damage. The physician's attention turned to ZYXA. Commander, this individual requires immediate medical intervention. The children, Marcus began, will be monitored by my staff until your return. ZYXA interrupted. You are no use to them if your hands become permanently disabled. It was a practical argument that Marcus couldn't refute. Reluctantly, he allowed himself to be escorted to the medical bay, though not before spending several minutes reassuring each of the affected children that they were safe and that he would return soon. The medical bay was an unsettling mixture of technology and biology, where machines grown rather than built monitored patient health through direct neural interfaces. Marcus found himself lying on what felt like a living examination table, while the physician worked to repair the electrical damage to his nervous system. You are fortunate, she informed him as biomechanical tendrils connected to various points on his body. A few more minutes of exposure would have resulted in cardiac arrest. The children couldn't wait a few more minutes. Ah yes, the human obsession with individual preservation over collective efficiency. The physician's tone carried mild curiosity rather than disapproval. It is a fascinating psychological quirk. It's not a quirk. Every life has value, even lives that will grow up to oppose your own species. It was the second time that day Marcus had been asked that question, and he was beginning to suspect it represented something more than idle curiosity. Yes, even then, interesting. The physician continued her work in silence for several minutes before speaking again. I have been monitoring the developmental data from the children under your care. Their psychological profiles are unlike anything in our medical databases. In what way? They display reduced stress responses, improved cognitive development, enhanced social adaptability, and what our psychologists describe as emotional stability. These traits are virtually unknown in traditional Vrex nursery environments. Marcus felt a warm sense of satisfaction. They're good kids. They just needed someone to show them they mattered. You speak of them with genuine affection. Of course I do. How could I not? Very easily, I would think. They represent the future enemies of your species. They will grow up to serve an empire that has conquered your worlds and enslaved your people. Logic would suggest resentment rather than affection. Marcus was quiet for a moment, feeling the strange sensations as biomechanical systems repaired the damage to his nervous system. I had a teacher once, he said finally, back on Earth when I was young. Mrs. Patterson. She used to say that hate was like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. An interesting metaphor. She was right. I could spend every day hating these children for what they might become, but all that would accomplish is making me bitter and less effective at caring for them. Instead, I choose to love them for what they are right now. Young creatures who need protection and care. And if they grow up to participate in raids against human colonies, if they command ships that hunt your people through space, then I'll be sad about the choices they made as adults. But I'll never regret giving them the best possible start in life. The physician completed her work and began disconnecting the biomechanical interfaces. You are medically cleared to return to duty. However, I am required to know in your file that you deliberately expose yourself to potentially lethal conditions. Will that cause problems for me? That decision will be made at levels far above my authority. She paused, then added, "For what it is worth, I have never encountered a being quite like you. Your psychological profile is unusual." Marcus sat up carefully, flexing his hands to test the effectiveness of the treatment. The burns were completely healed, and sensation had returned to normal in all his extremities. Unusual how? You appear to be incapable of hatred, even when hatred would be rationally justified. It is as if that emotional capacity has been completely replaced by something else. Compassion. Yes, though I suspect your species would consider such a transformation a form of psychological damage. Marcus considered this as he prepared to return to the nursery. Was he psychologically damaged? Had his experiences broken something fundamental in his emotional makeup? He didn't think so. If anything, he felt more whole now than he ever had during his years on Earth. "Maybe," he said finally, "but if being damaged means caring about children who need protection, then I can live with being damaged." When he returned to the nursery, Marcus found ZYXH still there, having personally supervised the children's care during his absence. The three who had experienced the environmental failure were alert and active, showing no signs of lasting trauma from their ordeal. "How do you feel?" she asked without preamble. "Good as new. The medical team did excellent work." Marcus resumed his rounds, checking on each child in turn. "Any problems while I was gone?" "None. Though I must inform you that I have filed my report regarding your unauthorized access to the biocore systems. I expected you would. What happens now?" "Now we wait. And we continue caring for the children under our protection." Marcus looked up in surprise. "Our protection?" ZYXH's compound eyes seemed to focus on something far beyond the nursery walls. "I've been giving considerable thought to our previous conversations about the value of individual lives, about mercy, about the importance of emotional bonds in proper development. And I find myself questioning many assumptions I have held without examination." She turned her attention to the pods containing the Queen's final clutch. "These children will be the future leaders of our empire. The decisions they make will affect billions of lives across hundreds of worlds. That's a heavy responsibility." "Yes, which is why I believe they should grow up knowing that strength comes not just from conquest and domination, but from the ability to protect those who cannot protect themselves." Marcus stared at her in amazement. "You want to help me teach them compassion? I want to ensure they become leaders worthy of the power they will wield." ZYXH moved to stand beside him, both of them looking at the developing eggs that contained the future of the Vrex Empire. "And I believe you are correct that kindness is never wasted." As if responding to their conversation, the eggs pulsed with brighter bioluminescence, and Marcus could swear he detected movement within the largest of them. Soon, very soon, the Queen's final children would enter the world. And when they did, they would find themselves cared for not just by a human who had chosen love over hate, but by a Vrex commander who was learning that true strength came from protecting rather than dominating. The foundation of something unprecedented was being laid in a small nursery on a distant space station, a bridge between species built not of treaties or technological exchange, but of shared commitment to the welfare of children who represented both hope and challenge for the future. And somewhere in the depths of the station, Queen New York Lath monitored the developments through her vast network of biological sensors, her ancient mind contemplating possibilities that had never before existed in the long history of her species. The first signs of hatching came at dawn, station time. Marcus had been monitoring the Queen's clutch for weeks, watching as the eggs grew larger and their internal bioluminescence became more complex and organized. But nothing had quite prepared him for the moment when the largest egg began to crack. "Commander," he called softly, not wanting to startle the developing hatchling with sudden loud noises. "It's beginning." ZYXH was at his side instantly, her own attention focused on the hairline fractures spreading across the egg's crystalline surface. "Should we alert the Queen?" "Not yet. First births can take several hours, and interruption during the process can cause complications." Marcus checked his instruments one final time, ensuring that temperature, humidity, and nutrient flow were all optimal. We just need to be patient and ready to assist if needed. The process was mesmerizing. Unlike the relatively straightforward hatching of standard Vrex eggs, this was clearly something far more complex. The fractures in the shell followed intricate geometric patterns, as if the hatchling inside was carefully and deliberately creating specific weak points. Bioluminescent fluid began seeping from the cracks, carrying with it complex chemical signatures that Marcus's instruments couldn't fully analyze. "I've never seen anything like this," ZYXA admitted, her voice hushed with what could only be described as reverence. "Standard hatchlings simply break through their shells when they're ready. This is art." She was right. What was emerging looked less like a birth and more like a carefully orchestrated performance. The shell was opening in layers, each one revealing new aspects of the creature within. And what Marcus could see through the growing apertures was unlike any Vrex hatchling he'd ever encountered. The young creature inside was larger than normal, yes, but that wasn't the most striking difference. Her carapace displayed patterns of bioluminescence, so complex they seemed to tell stories in light. Her limbs showed the elegant proportions that marked high-caste genetics, but there was something else, a refinement of form that spoke of generations of careful breeding. "She's beautiful," Marcus whispered. It took nearly 4 hours for the first hatchling to fully emerge from her shell. When she finally did, she was perfect, a tiny replica of adult Vrex nobility, but with the proportional adjustments necessary for proper development. She lay still for several minutes, breathing the station's atmosphere for the first time and allowing her nervous system to adjust to unfiltered sensory input. Then, she opened her eyes. Marcus had seen hundreds of newborn Vrex take their first look at the world. Usually, it was a moment of confusion and disorientation as their developing brains struggled to process unfamiliar sensations. But this hatchling's gaze was immediately focused and intelligent, taking in her surroundings with what seemed like analytical precision. Her eyes found Marcus first, and for a long moment, they simply regarded each other. Then, to his amazement, she made a sound he'd never heard from a newborn Vrex, something that was almost musical in its complexity. "Hello, little one," Marcus said softly, extending one finger toward the pod's observation window. "Welcome to the world." The hatchling responded by moving closer to the window, pressing one of her small appendages against the transparent barrier where Marcus's finger rested on the other side. The contact was brief, but Marcus felt a jolt of something that might have been recognition. "Remarkable ZYX hybrid. She's responding to you already." Over the next 3 days, 18 more eggs hatched in similarly elaborate displays. Each hatchling was unique, displaying genetic combinations that represented the culmination of Vrex selective breeding programs. But what struck Marcus most was their immediate awareness and responsiveness. Unlike normal newborns, who required weeks to develop meaningful interaction capabilities, these children seemed ready to engage with their environment almost from the moment of birth. By the end of the week, Marcus had established preliminary care routines for 19 healthy hatchlings. 4 eggs remained unhatched, but their internal monitors showed continued healthy development at slower rates. "They're all so different," he observed to ZYXA as they conducted their morning rounds. The newborns had already begun displaying distinct personalities. Some were more curious, others more cautious. A few showed early signs of the analytical thinking that marked future scientists, while others displayed the physical coordination that suggested military aptitude. "The Queen's final clutch represents the genetic diversity of our entire species," ZYXA explained. Each egg was specially designed to carry different combinations of traits. In theory, these 19 individuals could repopulate the entire Vrex empire if necessary. The weight of that responsibility settled on Marcus's shoulders like a physical presence. He was caring for living backups of an entire civilization. But as he watched them interact with their environment and with each other, he tried to push aside thoughts of their cosmic significance and focus on their immediate needs. "The 20th egg is showing increased activity," he noted, checking his instruments. "I think she'll hatch today. And the remaining 3, still developing normally, just at their own pace. Some children take longer than others to be ready for the world." As if summoned by their conversation, hairline cracks began appearing on the surface of the 20th egg. Marcus and ZYXHA took up their observation positions, ready to monitor another complex birth process. But this hatching was different from the others. The shell began cracking in the familiar geometric patterns, but the process seemed to stall partway through. The hatchling inside appeared to be struggling, her attempts to break through increasingly desperate. "Something's wrong," Marcus said, his hands already moving over the control interfaces. "She's not strong enough to complete the process." "Birth complications are not uncommon with advanced genetic lines," ZYXR replied, but her voice carried concern. "What are our options? I can manually assist by weakening specific sections of the shell, but it's risky. If I damage the wrong areas, I could harm her. If I don't act soon, she'll exhaust herself and die." Marcus studied the readouts, calculating angles and stress points with the precision of an engineer. The hatchling's vital signs were dropping as she continued her unsuccessful attempts to break free from her prison. "Make the choice," ZYXHA said quietly. "You know these children better than anyone else on the station." Taking a deep breath, Marcus activated the pod's manipulation tools. With microscopic precision, he began creating additional fracture lines in the shell, following the pattern the hatchling had already started but extending it into areas she couldn't reach. The work required absolute concentration. One wrong move could crack the shell too extensively, causing sudden decompression that would kill the developing child. Too little assistance, and she would remain trapped. Marcus found himself holding his breath as he worked, aware that ZYXHA was doing the same beside him. After what felt like hours but was actually only minutes, the shell finally gave way. The hatchling emerged in a rush of bioluminescent fluid, smaller than her siblings, but alive and breathing. "Is she?" ZYXHA began. "She's perfect," Marcus said, relief flooding through him as the hatchling's vital signs stabilized. "Just needed a little help getting started." The rescued hatchling was indeed smaller than her siblings, and her movements seemed less coordinated. But her eyes held the same intelligence Marcus had seen in the others, and when she looked at him, he saw something that might have been gratitude. "I'm going to call you Hope," he said softly, "because sometimes that's all we need to keep going." The next few weeks established a routine that was both familiar and entirely new. The 19 healthy hatchlings developed rapidly, displaying capabilities that amazed even ZYXHA. They began communicating with each other through complex patterns of bioluminescence, creating a visual language that was far more sophisticated than anything recorded for normal Vrex children. Hope, the rescued hatchling, required additional attention and specialized care. Her smaller size meant she needed more frequent feedings and closer temperature regulation. But she compensated for her physical limitations with remarkable intelligence, often solving environmental puzzles faster than her larger siblings. She learns from watching. Marcus observed as Hope successfully navigated a maze that had stumped several of her siblings. She studies what others do and finds more efficient solutions. Compensation behavior, ZYXHA noted. She's adapting to her limitations by developing enhanced analytical capabilities. She's not limited. She's different. And different can be just as valuable as standard. It was during the 4th week after the first hatching that everything changed. Marcus was conducting his usual evening rounds when alarms began sounding throughout the station. Not the localized alerts he'd become familiar with, but station-wide emergency signals. "What's happening?" he called to ZYXHA, who was immediately accessing her command communications. "Long-range sensors have detected a human fleet approaching our position," she replied, her voice tight with tension. "Estimated time to intercept, 6 hours. Marcus felt his blood turn cold. A human fleet meant one of two things: either a rescue mission, which seemed unlikely given how deep in Vrex space they were, or a strike force planning to destroy the station. Are they responding to communication attempts? All hail frequencies are being ignored. Fleet composition suggests aggressive intent. Around them, the hatchlings began making distress sounds, their bioluminescent patterns flickering with agitation. They could sense the tension in the adults' voices, even if they couldn't understand the source of the threat. "Commander," Marcus said carefully, "whatever happens, these children can't be harmed. Their innocence in this conflict. I'm aware of their value to the Empire." ZYXH's response was automatic, but Marcus caught the slight hesitation in her voice. Not to the Empire, to themselves. They're individuals with their own right to exist, regardless of their strategic importance. ZYXA turned to look at him, her compound eyes reflecting the soft bioluminescence of the nursery. You would say that even knowing this approaching fleet represents your own species. It was the moment Marcus had always known would come eventually. The moment when his conflicting loyalties would be tested in the most direct way possible. He looked around the nursery at the children who had become his purpose, his family, his reason for existing. Yes, he said without hesitation. I would say that, even if it means standing against your own kind. These children are my kind now. My responsibility. My family. Marcus moved to the central control panel and began implementing emergency protocols designed to protect the nursery in case of station damage. I won't let harm come to them, no matter who's doing the threatening. ZYXA watched him work for several minutes in silence. Then, to his surprise, she began assisting with the emergency preparations. The Queen will need to be informed, she said. Yes, and she'll need to make a decision about evacuation procedures. Evacuation? ZYXA paused in her work. The Queen would never abandon this station. It represents too much strategic value. Then, she needs to know that these children will be protected, whatever else happens. Marcus finished his preparations and turned to face YXA directly. Commander, I need you to understand something. If this station is attacked, if those children are threatened, I will do whatever is necessary to keep them safe. Even if that means working against the Vrex Empire. That would be treason against your caretaker duties. No, it would be fulfilling them. Another long silence. Then, ZYXA activated her communication system. Your Majesty, we require immediate consultation. The situation has become complex. The Queen's response came not through the communication system, but in person. Within minutes of ZYXA's call, the massive form of Queen New York Lath appeared in the nursery, having somehow traveled through the station's corridors despite her enormous size. My children, she said, and her mental voice carried an emotion Marcus had never heard from her before, fear. Are they safe? For now, Your Majesty. But the approaching human fleet represents a significant threat. The Queen's attention turned to Marcus, her dark eyes seeming to see straight through him. And you, human? What do you say about this threat from your own species? Marcus met her gaze steadily. I say that these children are under my protection, and I will defend them against any threat, regardless of its origin. Even against your own people, especially against my own people, if necessary. Children don't choose the circumstances of their birth, and they shouldn't suffer for the crimes of adults. The Queen studied him for what felt like an eternity. Around them, the hatchlings had begun gathering near the transparent walls of their enclosure, as if sensing the importance of the conversation taking place. Commander ZYXA, the Queen said finally, what is your assessment of this human's loyalties? His loyalty is to the children under his care, Your Majesty. Nothing else matters to him. Not to his species, not to his homeworld, not to his own freedom. No, Your Majesty. I have observed him extensively, and I am certain that his primary concern is the welfare of the young Vrex in his care. The Queen's attention returned to Marcus. Is this assessment accurate? Yes, Your Majesty. These children are my family now. My responsibility. My purpose. And if I asked you to help defend them against the approaching human fleet? The question hung in the air like a blade. Marcus felt the weight of what was being asked. Not just to remain neutral in a conflict between his birth species and his adopted one, but to actively oppose human forces. What would you need me to do? The approaching vessels will attempt to board this station. They will be looking for human prisoners to rescue. Your presence among the boarding parties could provide crucial intelligence about our defensive capabilities. Marcus understood immediately. The Queen was asking him to act as a spy, to betray any humans who might board the station in an attempt to rescue him and others like him. And in return, the children remain safe. All of them, including the 3 who have yet to hatch. Marcus looked around the nursery one final time, taking in the sight of 19 young Vrex who had come to depend on him for their very survival. Hope, the smallest and most fragile, pressed herself against her enclosure's wall, her bioluminescent patterns flickering with what he'd learned to recognize as anxiety. I'll do it, he said quietly, but I have conditions. You are hardly in a position to make demands. These aren't demands. They're requirements for my cooperation. Marcus's voice carried a steel that surprised even him. First, if the station is damaged, the children are evacuated before anyone else. Second, if I'm killed or captured, Commander ZYXA assumes full responsibility for their care. Third, regardless of the outcome of this battle, the children are never used as weapons or threatened to control my behavior. The Queen considered his conditions for a long moment. Acceptable. Now tell me, human, what is your real name? I find myself curious about the identity of the being who would betray his own species to protect mine. Marcus Chun, former Corporal, Terran Defense Force. Current caretaker to 22 of the most important children in the galaxy. Marcus Chun, the Queen repeated, her mental voice somehow making the simple human name sound almost musical. You have given me much to consider. Rest now. Tomorrow, we discover whether your commitment to my children is stronger than your bonds to your own kind. As the Queen departed, leaving Marcus alone with ZYXA and the children, the full weight of what he'd agreed to settled on his shoulders. In less than 6 hours, he would face human soldiers, possibly even people he'd served with, and he would have to convince them that he was still one of them while secretly working to protect the Vrex children who had become his world. The irony wasn't lost on him. A human soldier, trained to fight against the Vrex Empire, was now preparing to defend its most precious children against his own people. But as he looked at Hope and her siblings, all of them depending on him for their safety and security, Marcus knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. Tomorrow would test not just his resolve, but his ability to walk the narrow line between protection and betrayal. And somewhere in the approaching human fleet, other people faced their own impossible choices in a war where the lines between right and wrong had become as blurred as the stars themselves. The boarding alarms began at 0347 station time. Marcus had been awake for hours, unable to sleep while knowing what was coming. He'd spent the time making final preparations, ensuring the nursery's emergency protocols were fully activated, recording detailed care instructions for each individual hatchling, and trying to prepare himself mentally for what might be the most difficult performance of his life. Human vessels have breached hull sections 7 through 12, ZYXR reported, her voice tight with controlled tension. First contact in approximately 15 minutes. Marcus nodded, checking his appearance in the nursery's reflection panels. He'd cleaned himself up as much as possible, wanting to look like a rescued prisoner rather than a willing collaborator. The various cuts and bruises from his early days on the station had long since healed, but he'd managed to create some fresh marks that would support the illusion of recent mistreatment. Remember, ZYXA said quietly, you must convince them you are still loyal to humanity. Any suspicion that you have adapted to your circumstances could compromise everything. I understand. Marcus took one last look at the children in their enclosures. Most were sleeping, but Hope was awake, her small form pressed against the transparent wall, as if she sensed something was wrong. Take care of them. I will guard them with my life. I know you will. Marcus paused at the nursery's exit. Commander, thank you. For everything. Before ZYXA could respond, Marcus was gone, making his way through the station's corridors toward the predetermined meeting point. The sounds of combat were growing closer, the distinctive whine of human plasma weapons mixed with the organic roar of Vrex biocannons. Emergency lighting cast everything in an eerie red glow, and the air filled with the scent of burned metal and organic compounds. Marcus found what he was looking for 3 levels down from the nursery, a maintenance alcove where he could wait to be discovered by the human boarding party. He settled into the cramped space, activated a distress beacon on the frequency he'd been given, and began the hardest performance of his life. The first human voices he heard in over a year were both foreign and familiar. The accent was wrong. These soldiers were from the Centauri colonies rather than Earth. But the language was his own, the casual military banter that had once been as natural to him as breathing. Sweep complete on level 7. No resistance encountered. Copy that, Alpha Team. Proceed to level 8 and maintain formation. Any sign of human prisoners yet? Negative, but we're picking up a distress beacon 3 levels up. Marcus closed his eyes, preparing himself for the reunion he'd been dreading. When the search team finally found him, he was ready. Contact. Human civilian in maintenance alcove 77 Alpha. The team leader was a young lieutenant whose battle armor bore the insignia of the Colonial Marine Corps. She approached with her weapon raised, but not directly aimed, her face showing a mixture of relief and professional caution. "Are you injured?" she asked, kneeling beside him. "Nothing serious," Marcus replied, allowing exhaustion and relief to color his voice. "Just, God, I can't believe you're actually here. What's your name and unit designation?" Marcus Chun, former corporal, TDF 47th Engineering Battalion. Captured during the Battle of Kepler, 442, approximately 13 months ago. The lieutenant consulted her tactical display. "Marcus Chun, yes, you're on the MIA list. What's your status? Have you been mistreated?" Marcus gestured to his various superficial injuries. "The Vrex aren't known for their hospitality, but I'm alive, and that's more than a lot of prisoners can say." "Any other human prisoners on this station?" "A few, scattered throughout the facility. They use us for manual labor mostly." Marcus was careful to stick to information that wouldn't compromise the station's actual defensive preparations. "Listen, Lieutenant, I need to warn you about something. This isn't just a military outpost." "What do you mean?" "They're using this station as a breeding facility. There are hundreds of young Vrex here, maybe thousands. If your demolition teams are planning to destroy the station." The lieutenant's expression hardened. "Our orders are to extract human prisoners and eliminate strategic targets." Vrex breeding facilities are definitely strategic targets. Marcus felt his heart sink, but he kept his expression neutral. "I understand. I just thought you should know what you're dealing with." "Appreciated, Corporal. Can you move? We need to get you to the extraction point." "I can manage." Marcus allowed the lieutenant to help him to his feet, playing up his weakness more than was strictly necessary. "But there's something else. I've been assigned to work in one of their nursery sections. I might have intelligence about their breeding programs that your command would find valuable." The lieutenant's attention sharpened. "What kind of intelligence?" "Genetic modification programs. Advanced breeding techniques. They've been developing new castes with enhanced capabilities." Marcus was walking a careful line, providing information that would seem valuable while avoiding anything that could lead directly to the Queen's special children. "I could show your intelligence people the facilities I've had access to. That would be extremely valuable. Stay close to me, and we'll get you back to the fleet for debriefing." As they moved through the station's corridors, Marcus found himself cataloging every turn, every blast door, every defensive position they passed. Part of him was genuinely relieved to be among humans again, to hear his native language and see familiar facial expressions. But a larger part was counting the ways this rescue mission could threaten the children he'd sworn to protect. The human boarding party had been more successful than the Vrex defenders had anticipated. They'd managed to penetrate deep into the station's interior, and Marcus could see evidence of the advanced tactics and weapons that had made humanity such a dangerous opponent despite their technological disadvantages. The humans compensated for inferior firepower with superior strategy, and it was clear they'd studied Vrex station layouts extensively. "How many prisoners are we looking for?" Marcus asked as they navigated around a section where human demo charges had sealed off a corridor. "Intelligence estimates suggested maybe 24 humans being held on this station," the lieutenant replied. "But we've only found 8 so far, counting you. The others might be in secured sections." The Vrex compartmentalized their prisoners based on skill sets and security risks. It was a plausible explanation for the low numbers, and it seemed to satisfy the lieutenant. In reality, Marcus knew there were exactly 12 other human prisoners on the station, and most of them were in areas the boarding party was unlikely to reach. But he needed to maintain his cover as a rescued prisoner while subtly discouraging the humans from penetrating too deeply into the station's core areas. The extraction point was a docking bay that the human forces had secured after a fierce firefight. The deck was littered with the bodies of Vrex defenders, their bioluminescent blood creating weird patterns in the emergency lighting. Marcus tried not to look too closely at the casualties, focusing instead on the familiar lines of the human assault transport that had locked onto the station's docking collar. "Transport ship Defiance. This is Extraction Team Alpha," the lieutenant reported. "Package retrieved, plus intelligence asset. Requesting immediate departure for debriefing." Copy that, Alpha Team. Intelligence boys are eager to talk to your asset. As they prepare to board the transport, Marcus caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Through one of the bay's observation windows, he could see human demolition teams moving toward the station's central sections, the areas that contained not just the main breeding facilities, but the nursery where 22 irreplaceable children waited under Zoexha's protection. Lieutenant, he said urgently, those demolition charges, how extensive is the destruction going to be? Complete elimination of the target. The brass wants to make sure nothing of value survives. Marcus felt panic rising in his chest. The plan had been to provide intelligence that would help protect the children, but if the humans were planning to destroy the entire station, all his preparation would be meaningless. Wait, he said, grabbing the lieutenant's arm. There's something I didn't tell you about the breeding facilities. What? They're not just producing standard Vrex offspring. There's a special section, experimental genetics programs that could provide incredible intelligence value if captured intact. The lieutenant paused, her hand hovering over the transport's entry controls. What kind of experiments? Enhanced cognitive capabilities, improved physical performance, genetic modifications that could represent decades of research. Marcus was improvising desperately, trying to find something that would make the humans want to preserve rather than destroy the nursery. If your people could capture those specimens alive, the research value alone could change the course of the war. You're talking about live Vrex specimens. I'm talking about a chance to understand how they're enhancing their species. The kind of intelligence that could help humanity develop countermeasures, maybe even adaptive technologies of our own. Marcus could see the lieutenant weighing his words. Military officers were trained to evaluate intelligence value against operational risks, and he was hoping her training would override her desire for simple destruction. I'll need to run this up the chain of command, she said finally. But if you're right about the research value, it could change our mission parameters. I need to be there when you make the approach, Marcus said quickly. I know the layout of the facility, the security measures, the specific locations of the most valuable specimens. Without that knowledge, your people could destroy everything they're trying to capture. The lieutenant studied his face for a long moment. You realize you'd be volunteering to go back into enemy territory. I've been in enemy territory for over a year. A few more hours won't matter if it means providing intelligence that could help end this war. It was a calculated risk. Marcus was banking on human military psychology, the desire to achieve maximum intelligence value from any operation. If he could convince them that the nursery contained research opportunities rather than just enemy offspring, he might be able to guide their actions away from wholesale destruction. All right, Corporal, but this goes way above my authorization level. You'll be dealing directly with Fleet Command. The next 2 hours were a blur of military briefings, intelligence assessments, and strategic planning. Marcus found himself in the surreal position of being debriefed by human intelligence officers while simultaneously trying to protect Vrex children from those same officers. He provided detailed information about the station's layout, security measures, and defensive capabilities, all accurate intelligence that would help the human forces complete their mission more efficiently. But he was careful to frame his knowledge of the nursery in terms that would make preservation seem more valuable than destruction. The specimens in Section 7 represent the pinnacle of Vrex genetic engineering. He explained to a room full of military planners. We're talking about potential insights into biological enhancement techniques that could take human science decades to develop independently. What's your assessment of capture feasibility? Asked the mission commander, a hard-faced colonel whose uniform bore the scars of multiple engagements. Difficult but possible. The facility is heavily defended, but most of the defenses are automated. If we can approach during the night cycle when biological security systems are dormant, a small team could extract the specimens with minimal resistance. And you're volunteering to guide this team? I'm the only human who's seen the interior of that facility. Without my knowledge of the layout and security measures, any attempt at extraction would likely result in the destruction of the very specimens we're trying to capture. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind the colonel's eyes. The potential intelligence value versus the operational risks. The chance to gain crucial insight into enemy capabilities versus the resources required for a complex extraction mission. All right, Corporal, but understand that this is not a rescue mission. You'll be accompanying a military strike team with a specific objective. If circumstances require it, you'll be considered expendable. Understand, sir. What the colonel didn't understand was that Marcus had no intention of being rescued. His plan was to guide the human team to the nursery, convince them to preserve the children for research purposes, and then find a way to remain behind to continue his care duties. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only way he could see to protect both the children he loved and the human forces who thought they were saving him. As the strike team prepared for their return to the station, Marcus equipped himself with captured Vrex bioarmor and weapons, playing the part of a human operative preparing for a dangerous mission. But in his heart, he was a caretaker getting ready to face the ultimate test of his commitment to the children who had become his world. The transport that carried them back to the station was filled with elite human special forces, men and women whose entire purpose was the efficient application of violence in service of their species' survival. They treated Marcus with a professional courtesy due to her intelligence asset, but he could see the questions in their eyes. No human should be this familiar with Vrex technology and procedures. No prisoner should be this comfortable with enemy systems. Remember, the team leader briefed them as they approached the docking bay. Our primary objective is specimen acquisition. Secondary objective is intelligence gathering. Tertiary objective is facility destruction. Corporal Chun will guide us to the target area, but once we're in position, he follows our lead. Marcus nodded agreement, knowing that everything would change once they reached the nursery, and the team saw exactly what they were being asked to capture. 22 young Vrex, some barely hatched, all of them completely dependent on the care they'd been receiving. And somewhere among those children, hope would be waiting. The smallest, most fragile member of the Queen's final clutch, the one who had needed Marcus's help just to be born, who represented both the pinnacle of Vrex genetic engineering and the simple, universal need of any child for protection and love. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of those children, but the future relationship between two species locked in a war that had consumed countless lives on both sides. And at the center of it all was a human caretaker who had somehow become the bridge between worlds, preparing to make choices that would define not just his own destiny, but the destiny of the most important children in the galaxy. The approach to the nursery was eerily quiet. The sounds of battle that had echoed through the station's corridors had faded to distant rumbles, and emergency lighting cast shifting shadows that made every corner a potential threat. Marcus led the human strike team through passages he'd walked hundreds of times, but now each familiar turn felt like a step toward either salvation or catastrophe. "Contact ahead," whispered Sergeant Torres, the team's point man. Through his enhanced optical gear, he'd spotted the two Vrex guards positioned outside the nursery's main entrance. Marcus's heart sank. ZYXA had posted guards, a clear indication that she expected trouble. The presence of armed defenders would make it nearly impossible to convince the human team that this was simply a research facility rather than a military target. Two hostiles, armed with biocannons, Torres reported. Standard elimination protocol? Wait, Marcus said quickly, his mind racing. Let me try to approach first. They know me. I might be able to get close enough for you to take them quietly. The team leader, Captain Voss, considered this for a moment. Negative. Too risky. We'll use flash charges and breach simultaneously. Captain, please. If those guards start shooting, they'll trigger station-wide alarms. Every defensive system in this section will.